The following reading is the correspondence of Asahel Nettleton upon the new measures of Charles Finney from 1827, January 13th, a letter to Reverend Mr. Aiken of Utica, written from Albany. My dear brother, would that I had time and strength to give you particulars on the state of religion in this region and elsewhere. In Albany, it is interesting, but I have great fears that the disposition of some zealous Christians round about us to proclaim it abroad and to run before their own hearts and the real state of things will run it out into noise. I have already felt the evil. I find that many are disposed to make 10 times as much of the state of things as I have been in the habit of doing, though they know but a small part of what I have seen in this place. I have met a number of circles of different kinds. Some are rejoicing in hope, and a number anxious for their souls. Various reports have gone out concerning a revival in Albany, which has done us much mischief. If they would let us alone, I should expect a great work in this city. But among so much noise and bluster of Christians, it promises fair to end in smoke. But after all, the good people here are astonished at our stillness. My opinion is that had they been 10 times as still, they would already have witnessed 10 times as much. 70 years ago, about 2,000 souls were hopefully born into the kingdom in this vicinity, in our own denomination, with comparative stillness. But the times have altered. The kingdom of God now comes with great observation. Opposition from the world is always to be expected. It is idle for any minister to expect a revival without it. But when it enters the church of God, the friends of Zion cannot but take the alarm. There is doubtless a work of grace in Troy. Many sinners have hopefully been born into the kingdom, but it has been at an awful expense. Many of our first ministers have visited the place to witness for themselves. Such men as Edward Dorr Griffin, Ebenezer Porter of Catskill, William Knott, Mr. Tucker, Mr. Cornelius, and many more. Some of them have heard a number of sermons. After giving credit for preaching much truth, they uniformly say, "I never heard the name of God used with such a reverence." Dr. Griffin gave me a number of specimens. I do not wish to retail them. The church in Troy is greatly divided. Some have taken a dismission, others are consulting neighboring ministers about the path of duty, and others are beginning to attend worship by themselves. But the worst is not told. The spirit of denunciation which has grown out of the mode of conducting the revivals at the West is truly alarming. We do not call in question the genuineness of that revival, or the purity of the motives of those who have been the most active in it. You doubtless are reaping and rejoicing in their happy fruits. But the evils to which I allude are felt by the churches abroad, members of which have gone out to catch the Spirit and have returned, some grieved, others soured, and denouncing ministers, colleges, theological seminaries, and have set whole churches by the ears and kept them in turmoil for months together. Some students in divinity have done more mischief in this way than they can ever repair. I could mention names, but for exposing them. Some ministers and professors of religion have been to Troy from the surrounding region on purpose to catch the flame, and have returned home saying, "We don't want such a revival as they have in Troy." I went down to H a short time since and spent a Sabbath, and there met 7 or 8 ministers from various parts. And you would be perfectly astonished to hear them tell the troubles which have been introduced into their churches from the Western revivals. The church in H has been a complete turmoil all summer long, occasioned by a student in divinity who had heard Mr. Finney. He commenced operations to have a revival on the new plan. He found fault with everything the settled minister was doing, and raised an angry dispute about females praying in promiscuous assemblies. He went about trying to raise a party to break down the pastor, as he called it. I cannot be particular only before he came to the place there was some attention and a few conversions, but a desperate attempt to introduce the practice of females praying with males raised an angry dispute which lasted all summer. And they had a revival of anger in the church, but no more conversions. This account I had from the lips of the ministers of the place, his wife in session. That you may understand my meaning, I have given this only as a specimen. The evil is running in all directions. A number of churches have experienced a revival of anger, wrath, malice, envy, and evil speaking without the knowledge of a single conversion, merely in consequence of a desperate attempt to introduce these new measures. Those ministers and Christians who have heretofore been most and longest acquainted with revivals are most alarmed at the spirit which has grown out of the revivals of the West. This spirit has no doubt greatly deteriorated by transportation. As we now have it, the great contest is among professors of religion, a civil war in Zion, a domestic broil in the household of faith. The friends of Charles Finney are certainly doing him and the cause of Christ great mischief. They seem more anxious to convert ministers and Christians to their peculiarities than to convert souls to Christ. It is just such a contest as I have sometimes seen in its incipient stages in New England between some young revival ministers on the one side and whole associations of ministers on the other. The young revival ministers, wishing to extend the work into all the churches, in their zeal would enter the limits of settled pastors and commence their operations, and plead my own example for all their movements, and so the war would begin, and all those ministers who would not yield the reins and sanction their imprudences would be sure to be proclaimed as enemies to revivals. Being thus defeated, these young ministers would come to me to make their complaints, and to work on my mind a conviction that all those ministers were enemies to myself, whereas the whole evil lay in a violation of all the rules of ministerial order and Christian meekness, or any inexperienced ignorance and imprudence of these young ministers. I'm sorry to speak thus of my best friends, but it is due to my brethren to say that those very ministers who had been thus slandered by my young brethren have since come to me with tears, urging me to visit their flocks. There is not one of them but would bid me a welcome and would rejoice in a revival, but they would not invite these young ministers to preach for them, who had been so rash in their proceedings and guilty of slandering them as stupid and dead and enemies of revivals. In this manner, some of the most promising young revival ministers have run themselves out and lost the confidence of settled pastors and Christians in general. The spirit of denunciation which has grown out of these Western revivals seems to be owing to the implicit confidence which has been placed in the proceedings of just such young ministers as leaders. They dare not attempt to correct any of their irregularities for fear of doing mischief, or of being denounced as enemies to revivals. This I know to be the fact. Charles Finney himself has been scarcely 3 years in the ministry, and has had no time to look at consequences. He has gone with all the zeal of a young convert without a friend to check or guide him, and I have no doubt that he begins with astonishment to look at the evils which are running before him. The account which his particular friends give of his proceedings is in substance as follows. He has got ministers to agree with them only by crushing or breaking them down. The method by which he does it is by creating a necessity, by getting a few individuals in a church to join him, and then all those who will not go all lengths with him are denounced as enemies to revivals. And rather than have such a bad name, one and another falls in to defend him, and then they proclaim what ministers, elders, and men of influence have been crushed or broken down. This moral influence being increased, others are denounced in a similar manner as standing out and leading sinners to hell. And to get rid of the noise and save himself, another will break down. And so they wax hotter and hotter until the church is fairly split in two. And now as for those elders and Christians who have thus been converted to these measures, Some of them are sending out private word to their Christian friends abroad as follows. I've been fairly skinned by the denunciations of these men and have ceased to oppose them to get rid of their noise. But I warn you not to introduce the spirit into your church and society. And so, Charles Finney's supposed friends, men of influence, are sending out word to warn others to beware of the evils which they have experienced. I heartily pity Charles Finney, for I believe him to be a good man and wishing to do good, but nobody dares tell him that a train of causes is set in operation and urged on by his own friends, which is likely to ruin his usefulness. I have become acquainted with some of the young preachers who profess to have taken their stamp from Charles Finney. I do not believe that there is much in them of the original. I am sorry to say that the spirit which they manifest and unwittingly diffuse appears to me to resemble anything rather than the wisdom which is from above, or the fruits of the Spirit. The minister who should exhort Christians in the following strain, put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another and forgiving one another, I fear would be denounced as being far, very far behind the spirit of the times. They do cultivate and awaken in others what very much resembles a passion of anger, wrath, malice, envy, and evil speaking. This is the inevitable consequence of their style of preaching. As Dr. Griffin observed, quote, it sounds like the accredited language of profanity, end quote, or as a pious woman of color in Troy expressed it, I do wonder what has got into all the ministers to swear so much in the pulpit. There is not a minister of my acquaintance who has visited Troy and heard a number of sermons, but is alarmed on this subject. I have noticed that the most pious and devoted Christians from the revivals where I have been are the last to fellowship these men in their measures, and that those professors whose piety has heretofore been considered the most superficial or doubtful are the first to fall in with both. I accept a few pious persons who have never witnessed a revival in any form, and are anxious for one, and the reason to my mind is perfectly obvious. It requires nothing but zeal without knowledge. Whoever has made himself acquainted with the state of things in New England near the close of the revival in the days of George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards cannot but weep over its likeness to the present. It is affecting that the warm friends of Zion should unwittingly betray her best interests. But so was it then. The young itinerants, in their zeal to extend the work, began to denounce all those settled ministers who would not go all length with them. And then those members of churches who loved their pastors would assemble around to defend them, while those who favored the itinerants assembled around them and, imbibing their spirit, of course lost all confidence in a settled ministry. And so the churches were split in two. The Spirit of God took its flight, and darkness and discord reigned for half a century. And those preachers who had taken the lead, having cultivated such a spirit, began to fall into awful darkness themselves when they saw the ruin that followed their labors. Some of them made and published their recantations to the world, which are now extant. But it was too late. A retribution followed. Some few of the young converts were called to order by David Brainerd, who passed through Connecticut at that time. But after their recantations, these leaders were generally denounced by their own followers. Could Whitefield and Edwards and Brainerd and James Davenport now arise from the dead, I have no doubt they would exclaim, "Young men, beware, beware." In the remarks which I have made, you will understand me. I separate between the efficacy of the measures adopted in the Western revivals and the evils which have grown out of those measures. Of the former I have no doubt, but the latter are certainly calamitous beyond anything I ever witnessed. Some of the subjects of these revivals and others who have been present in them are scattered over the country far from those scenes of operation. The tidings of the means used are told by those who have never witnessed a revival in any other form. Now these means are very simple, and just such as everybody can use, male and female. Who cannot call his minister stupid and dead and pray for him by name as such? And if he gets mad, and all the church also, no matter for that, the more opposition the better. This is certainly the way to have a revival, for it is Mr. Finney's method, and he has the sanction of such men as Mr. Langsing and Aiken and others. They did not believe in such measures at first, but they have been broken down. In this way, some of our best ministers are slandered, the church is divided, and the efficacy of the regular services of the settled ministry destroyed, overlooking the fact that the very means employed with wonderful success in the midst of a powerful revival are generally the very worst when carried out of the field of such an excitement. Some students in divinity and others in their attempts to imitate Charles Finney have reminded us of the conduct and success of the 7 sons of Sceva, who undertook to imitate Paul in Acts 19. The practice of females praying in promiscuous assemblies is considered as absolutely indispensable, so that nothing can possibly be done without it. Sorry to say that some young men have been considered as acting amorously foolish on this subject. The practice itself is very taking with some real Christians, no doubt, but still more so with the hypocritical and disorganizing part of society. Ministers have been told by such persons that they were too proud to permit females to pray before them, that they never could have a revival until they were willing to come down to that practice. Some of my brethren have been absolutely insulted by females on this subject. Thus many ministers and churches are tormented in the spirit of a revival utterly destroyed in some places and prevented in others. If our brethren at the West knew the evils that are felt by settled ministers abroad, I know they could not but weep over them. In the language of Dr. Griffin, it is complete radicalism. The means which it is said have been so successful at the West have been so caricatured by the ignoble boldness and religion running before Charles Finney into every city and town, far and near, that I am sure he must labor under prodigious disadvantage in all these places without shifting the entire mode of his attack. The consciences of the wicked have become more callous than ever. Their language is, "I want no such religion." The hearts of our best ministers and Christians generally are grieved and exceedingly alarmed on this subject. It is owing entirely to the disorganizing spirit which has already been introduced into their churches. The ministers in general, so far as I am acquainted, are afraid to invite Charles Finney, or any who adopt his peculiarities, to preach for them. Some of Charles Finney's younger brethren and friends may attempt to work on his mind the conviction that most of our ministers and churches are enemies to revivals and unfriendly to himself. I feel it my duty to speak in their behalf. I know it to be a mistake. The best friends of revivals, as they have heretofore witnessed them, are certainly the most afraid to invite him into their churches, and are the most alarmed at the evils that are rising. And I must say that his friends are certainly laboring to introduce those very measures which I have ever regarded as ultimately working ruin to our churches, and against which I have always guarded as ruinous to the characters of revival, as well as to my own usefulness. For example, whoever introduces the practice of females praying in promiscuous assemblies, let the practice once become general, will ere long find to his sorrow that he has made an inlet to other denominations and entailed an everlasting quarrel on those churches generally. If settled pastors choose to do it on their own responsibility, so be it. For one, I dare not assume so great a responsibility. In this way churches were once laid waste. And it is by keeping out and carefully avoiding everything of this kind that some of them have again been built. Others kept orderly, and the character of revivals for 30 years past has been guarded. If the evil be not soon prevented, a generation will arise in inheriting all the obliquities of their leaders, not knowing that a revival ever did or can exist without all those evils. And these evils are destined to be propagated from generation to generation, waxing worse and worse. The friends of Charles Finney are afraid to interfere to correct anything, lest they should do mischief, or be denounced as enemies of revivals. Brother Nettleton, do come into this region and help us, for many things are becoming current among us which I cannot approve, and I can do nothing to correct them, but I am immediately shamed out of it by being denounced as an enemy to revivals. Thus my ministerial brethren from the West, whose views accord with my own, have been calling to me in their letters during the summer past. There is religion in it, and I dare not touch it. I see the evil and tremble at the consequences, but what can I do? This is the language of many of his warmest friends. And so the bad must all be defended with the good. This sentiment adopted will certainly ruin revivals. It is the language of a novice. It is just as the devil would have it. If the friends of revivals dare not correct their own faults, who will do it for them? I know no such policy. I would no more dare defend in the gross than condemn in the gross. And those who adopt the former practice will soon be compelled by prevailing corruptions to take along with it the latter. The character of revivals is to be sustained on the same principles as that of churches or individual Christians. If we would judge ourselves, we should not be judged. It is not by covering but confessing and forsaking that pure revivals are to prosper. In this manner their character has long been sustained. Things have not been left to run to such length in our day. A strong hand has been laid on young converts, old professors, and especially on zealous young ministers, as many of them now living can testify. I have been afraid to kindle fires where there was not some spiritual watchman near, to guard and watch against wildness for which I might become responsible. Some students in divinity have caught and carried the flame into neighboring towns and villages, and no doubt have been the means of the salvation of some souls. But I am sorry to say that some of them have run before me into the most populous places, and have carried their measures so far, and have become so dictatorial and assuming that in the opinion of the most judicious and influential ministers of my acquaintance, they have done far more mischief than good. They have pleaded my example for many measures which, as to time and circumstances, I utterly condemn. Some of the means which I have never dared to employ, except in the most interesting crisis of a powerful revival, they have caricatured in such a manner, and raised such prejudices against myself among strangers that they have caused me much trouble. My plans have been laid to visit many towns and cities, and have been wholly defeated by those students in divinity thus running before me. I have been much grieved and exceedingly perplexed on this subject. They assume an authority unwittingly, I allow, and adopt measures which no ordained minister could do without ruining his usefulness. Evils arising hence have uniformly been arrested in their progress by my taking the part of settled pastors among their flocks at a great expense of feeling, on the part of my young friends, no doubt, but the cause of revivals evidently required it. I have been anxiously looking and waiting all summer long for such men as yourself and Mr. Lansing, and others most intimately acquainted with Charles Finney, to take hold with a kind severity and restore order, but in vain. It is not expected that a powerful revival can exist among imperfect beings without more or less irregularity and opposition, but it is expected that these things will generally subside, and leave the churches in a more peaceful, happy, and flourishing state than ever. This has uniformly been the case where revivals have prevailed. But irregularities are prevailing so fast, and assuming such a character in our churches is infinitely to overbalance the good that is left. These evils sooner or later must be corrected. Somebody must speak, or silence will prove our ruin. Fire is an excellent thing in its place, and I am not afraid to see it blaze among briars and thorns. But when I see it kindling where it will ruin fences and gardens and houses, and burn up my friends, I cannot be silent. Had evil been checked in the commencement, it would have been an act of kindness to Charles Finney and great gain to the cause of revivals. He would have found ministers everywhere bidding him welcome. His help is everywhere greatly needed. For a settled pastor, the entire confidence of other ministers would not be so important. But whoever undertakes to promote revivals by running through the world in this age of revivals must have the entire confidence of settled ministers generally. Otherwise he will unsettle ministers in desolate churches wherever he goes. Without their hearty cooperation he will certainly labor at a great disadvantage, as if a mariner steering a ship in a storm at sea and his ill should quit the helm and ply his strength at the mast. The practice of praying for people by name in the closet and the social circle has no doubt had a beneficial effect, but as it now exists in many places, it has become in the eye of the Christian community at large an engine of public slander in its worst form. I should not dare in this solemn manner to arraign a fellow sinner before a public assembly, without his own particular request, unless my expressions were of the most conciliatory kind. And no Christian minister, whatever his character may be, can adopt a practice without awakening the indignation of the world at large, and of Christians generally against him. Much less can it be done by anybody and everybody who takes it into his head positively to decide the question, and to tell God and the world that such and such persons are unconverted. I do not believe, whatever may be the effect upon the individual thus named, that God will regard such a prayer in any other light than as that of a proud, self-righteous Pharisee. There is another interesting topic that lies near my heart, but the time would fail me to express my views and feelings on the subject. That holy, humble, meek, modest, retiring form, sometimes called the spirit of prayer, and which I have ever regarded as the unfailing precursor of a revival of religion, has been dragged from her closet and so rudely handled by some of her professed friends, that she has not only lost all her wonted loveliness, but is now stalking the streets in some places stark mad. Some in their zeal on the subject of the prayer of faith are tormenting others with their peculiar sentiments, which, if correct, everybody sees must equally condemn themselves, thus rendering themselves and their sentiments perfectly ridiculous. I have given you but an imperfect sketch of my own and the views of our brethren abroad on the subject, but as I assure you as a whole, it is not overdrawn. How to correct those growing evils I cannot tell. Our brethren far and near, some of Charles Finney's best friends at the West not excepted, by letter and otherwise, have long been urging me to lay the subject fully before him. The evils which have existed abroad have certainly been very much concealed from him and his friends. It is certainly right that he should know something of the evils which have run from under him, and the feelings of the friends of Zion at large. I have nothing to say to him in the style of crimination or controversy. I have been too long in the field of battle to be frightened about little things, or to make a man an offender for a word. For Zion's sake, I wish to save Charles Finney from a course which I am confident will greatly retard his usefulness before he knows it. It is no reflection on his talents or piety that in his zeal to save souls he should adopt every measure which promises present success regardless of consequences, nor after a fair experiment in so noble a cause to say I have pushed some things beyond what they will bear. The most useful lessons are learned by experience. I wish I had health and strength to show Brother Finney my whole heart on this subject. I have long been wishing to correct some of his peculiarities, that I might invite him into my own field and introduce him to my friends. Aside from feeble health, one consideration only has prevented me from making the attempt. Some of his particular friends are urging him on to the very things which I wish him to drop. I fear that their flattering representations will overrule all that I can say. And having dropped these peculiarities, his labors for a while might be less successful, and then he would resort again to the same experiment. But I can inform him that the same measures which he has adopted have been vigorously and obstinately pursued in New England against the repeated advice of settled pastors, and that, too, by one of the most powerful and successful ministers that I have ever known, until confident of his own strength he quit them all with this expression, "We will see who will answer by fire," a most unhappy expression, as he afterwards told me with tears. The result was he lost his usefulness in our denomination. Some of his spiritual children, now excellent men in the ministry, have never dared to adopt his measures, but have uniformly opposed them. Others, some ministers and laymen who followed him, became disorganizers, and the leader himself turned Baptist and soon after died. There is another method of conducting revivals which may avoid these difficulties. Settled pastors occupy nearly the whole field of operation. They have and ought to have the entire management in their own congregation. Each one has a right to pursue his own measures within his own limits, and no itinerant has any business to interfere or dictate. It will ever be regarded as intermeddling in other men's matters. If they do not choose to invite me into their field, my business is meekly and silently to retire, and I have no right to complain. But many young men are continually violating the rules of ministerial order and Christian propriety in these respects. Impatient to see the temple rise, They are now doing that which, it appears to me, will tend ultimately more than anything else to defeat the end which they wish to accomplish. They are now pulling down in many places the very things which I have been helping ministers to build up, and for which I have often received their warmest thanks. It is a sentiment which I have had frequent occasion to repeat to my young brethren in the ministry. Better forego the prospect of much present good in your own opinion, than to lose the confidence of settled ministers without which you cannot be long and extensively useful. There is certainly another and a lawful point of attack on the kingdom of darkness, which, when you have taken and it is seen, possesses wonderful advantages. It will give no offense to the church of God. It will be sure to rally around you every faithful soldier of the cross. Though it may seem too slow and silent in its operation, yet being the lawful method of conducting this warfare, it will secure the confidence of ministers and Christians, the consciences of the wicked, and a crown of glory. And now, brother, I venture to lay before you the subject of my prayers and tears, and I may add the subject which brought me back to a region which I never expected to visit again. If you discover anything in this communication unchristian or unkind, you will pardon it. If in your opinion it can do no mischief, or will do any possible good, you are at full liberty to show it to Charles Finney, or any of the friends of Zion whom it may concern. We will lay the subject at the feet of our divine Master, and there we will leave it. Yours in the best of bonds, Asahel Nettleton. New York, December 6, 1827. The previous letter was written sometime last December, immediately after a second interview with Charles Finney. From personal conversation with himself, but more particularly with his friends, I learned that they had adopted and defended measures which I have ever regarded as exceedingly calamitous to the cause of revivals. This letter was written originally as an expression of my own and the views of my brethren generally on this subject, without intending to send it to any one, as my opinion was repeatedly solicited on the subject by the friends of Mr. F. I thought it best to give it in writing. Accordingly, this letter was read at different times to not less than 20 ministers, and to some who had adopted the measures in question. In this silent manner I labored for a number of weeks, hoping to persuade the latter to drop them. But to my surprise I found that my own name was continually employed to give them sanction, nor was it in my power to prevent this perversion without publishing my views to the world. It was concluded that the subject of these new measures, unless they were speedily corrected, must sooner or later come before the Christian public. And as all the ministers who had kindly attempted to interfere to correct them, as ruinous to revivals, had so long and so often had their motives impeached and misrepresented, and been announced as cold and stupid and dead, that they had now ceased to do it. It was also concluded that by this time our Western brethren might possibly be ignorant of the views and feelings of the Christian community on this subject. Their long silence might be misconstrued into an acquiescence in those measures. It was well known, however, that New England as a body, and also the Presbyterian Church as a body, as well as the Friends of Revivals in general, would not defend the measures in question, nor be responsible for any of the evils which as they would certainly occasion. As preparatory to publishing and a cut-off occasion for after complaints, it was thought best that I should delay no longer sending a communication to some one or more of our brethren in the Oneida Presbytery. The above document is one and only a small part of what I have written to the members of that body. What I have done in laying the subject before them was not done without the knowledge and approbation of the watchmen of Israel, the long, the tried, the acknowledged friends of Zion. The question has often been asked, why did not Mr. Nettleton tell Mr. F. his views before he published them to the world? I have done it in as gentle a manner on paper as I knew how to do it, and I leave it to all the friends of Zion whether I could have chosen a better method. The report is in extensive circulation that Mr. F. had long been waiting to see Mr. Nettleton, and that he was willing to sit at his feet and learn. This honor of which I am unworthy I would have gladly declined had it been in my power. If, however, his wishing to sit at my feet and learn was not an after device to justify himself in correcting nothing, he will not say that I have not taken some care and pains to instruct him. One lesson which was given him is the above letter, which having been sent to Utica, was duly received and laid before him and a number of his friends. The pupil, who should tell how willing he was to learn, and complain to his neighbors that his teacher would not instruct him, would excite little sympathy with the public if it were known that he was at the same time carrying his lesson in his pocket. After consultation, some advised to conceal it, but this could not be done. And now in January, for the first time, Mr. F. preached a sermon in Utica from these words, "How can two walk together except they be agreed?" It was afterwards preached in Troy. Some who have talked and written so knowingly on the sermon, as though Troy were its birthplace, need not be informed that they have traveled out of the record. I do not state this because I have adopted their opinion that the contents of a sermon professedly on the subject of vital piety cannot be well understood without a knowledge of its origin. But some who were present and heard the sermon in Utica were simple enough to consider it as a personal attack upon the author of this letter. I was immediately informed by persons who were present and heard both the letter and the sermon that probably nothing would be corrected, and that arrangements would be made accordingly. Though Mr. Finney blazed and burned in his sermon, as I was informed, yet I did not feel at all offended. But soon the mournful tidings reached my ears. Mr. Nettleton has lost his mind. He is not the man he once was. His character is sunk wonderfully. These lies came from hell and the smoke, from the bottomless pit. How these reports were set in circulation, I did not take the trouble to ask. I can still repeat the language of my letter. I have been too long on the field of battle to be frightened with little things or to make a man an offender for a word. For Zion's sake, I wish to save Brother Finney from a course which I am confident will greatly retard his usefulness before he knows it. Had the friends of the new measures been kind enough to inform us of their determination not to renounce them, it might have saved their brethren much painful anxiety and many fruitless exertions. But let them no longer use the names of their brethren to sanction measures which they have always utterly condemned. They have full liberty to introduce them in their own names and on their own responsibility. For one, I feel bound by the solemnity attached to the ministerial office to declare to the watchmen of Israel my views of the danger of these measures, and in this public and decided manner to clear my conscience from lending my name to sanction their past, their present, or their future calamitous consequences. And the friends of these new measures are invited and earnestly solicited to come out with their names and their defense in the same public and decided manner. I had long since a copy of this letter corrected for the press, but to cut off occasion for complaint, I published it entire without those corrections. It has been publicly charged in the Western Recorder with containing false statements. As this is a little out of order, the public will excuse me for not replying to an unknown charge brought by an unknown traveler. He complains that the public have been kept in darkness long enough. I think so too. There are a number of such travelers for whose sake I send out this letter, hoping to shed some light on their path. End quote. Asahel, Nettleton.
O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder